everybody, I hope that you're all doing really well. So today I am back to talk about the books that I read in the first half of April. I actually feel like April's been a really good reading month after March, where I felt like I was barely reading anything at all, and the stuff that I was reading I didn't feel like I had much to say about. Whereas now I'm coming back to you in the middle of April and I've already read 9 books. Like, what is this productivity? How did this happen? To be honest with you, I'm not really sure how this has happened, but I'm just gonna go with it. I'm not gonna complain. I've got quite a few books to talk to you about, so let's just get started. The first thing that I finished in April was A Curious History of Sex by Kate Lister. This is a book that I've been really keen to get to for quite a while, and I finally picked it up as a birthday present to myself after it came out in this gorgeous little paperback. And this basically provides an academic but like quite colloquial, quite chatty history of sexuality and our attitudes to sex and sexual behaviour, from ancient Greece and ancient Rome right through to the present day. So many different topics are covered in here, talking about sex work, the history of contraception, our vernacular and particular language that we use in discussing sex and sexuality, as well as things like FGM, sexual-based racism, and fetishization. I can never say that word. I think it's a really good introduction to this topic, and it was really nice to actually get back to this. And as somebody who had studied this quite a bit in my third year of uni, it was a really nice return and has prompted me to pick up other books on this topic. Definitely one of my favourite books that I've read this month. Highly recommend. A fiction book that I finished in April was The Reader on the 627 by Jean-Paul Didierlaurent. The running gag of Charlotte doesn't know how to pronounce French words. This was a gift that I got from Char over at Thoroughly Enjoyed Books, so thank you very much, Char, for this. And this short little book tells the story of a man who is very dissatisfied with his life, particularly because of his job. He works at a book pulping factory, basically where publishers send off books that they haven't sold to be pulped because they're no good to anybody in their eyes. And this man does not take any satisfaction in this job. He finds it quite disgusting what he has to do. And like I say, he is generally dissatisfied with his life, going to work, coming home, not really having much of a life in between that. And the only way that he does end up having any sort of satisfaction with his life is that he ends up stealing pages that the pulping machine has not quite managed to get, and then he will read them out to people on the 627 metro. He reads them out to the other passengers, who are maybe initially a little bit dubious but find it very charming, even as the pages that he performs to people are not really related, and he slowly but surely starts to find meaning in his life this way. I thought this was a really sweet story, and I particularly liked this message of being able to find joy and meaning in a very monotonous, very routine, mundane life, and how essential that is for people. However, there was a little bit of an aspect to this story, a little plot element that I wasn't so keen on, and I don't want to spoil it too much for people, but if I give an allusion to Attachments by Rainbow Rowell and that plot, anybody who has read this might know what I mean by that. I felt like if the author had just cut that aspect of the plot out, then I would have found this a 5-star in that way, because it was a really sweet story. And thank you very much, Char, for sending me that book. Next up, a book that I picked up very much inspired by reading A Curious History of Sex was this, Strange Antics, A History of Seduction by Clement Knox. I also especially picked this up after seeing Leanne Rose buy it. I think what I didn't know going into this book was that this isn't like a long history of seduction and the way that we have depicted seduction and thought about seduction in society. It actually is much more of a history of the last 300 years, whereas I thought this was going to be delving a little bit further back. Another thing to note about this book is that I would also not say that it's kind of a general history of our depictions of seduction. I was kind of expecting this book to be more of a commentary on that, whereas what you find with this book is that there are just a lot of lengthy biographies of different people, different famous people throughout history. So for example, we talk about Lord Byron, Percy and Mary Shelley, we talk about Casanova, Samuel Richardson and his writing of Pamela and Clarissa. And yes, these characters are all very much linked to this idea of seduction, but it felt kind of very loosely connected. At times it felt like Clement Knox was just really interested in these different figures and wanted to retell their stories, and then was kind of like, oh, I need to find a narrative to kind of link all of these together. I guess we can talk about seduction. And in that way, I didn't really find his exploration of this topic to be very satisfying. And I feel like that would kind of rub other people up the wrong way. I was able to enjoy these stories because I already know that I like these figures and I like hearing more about them. Whereas I think a first-time reader who's never heard of these people and has never heard about their lives would find it a little bit jarring. I also found the conclusion to this a little bit confusing. He basically goes from talking about these different historic figures to then talking about like the incel community online and trying to make a connection to the way that we've spoken about seduction in the past to this community now and the lessons that we can take. And I just felt like it wasn't very strongly connected. I thought it was a bit weak. Like I say, what lifted this book for me was the fact that I already knew that I liked these figures. I already found them interesting rather than his own writing and his own way of retelling their stories. I am still glad to have this. I think if you are interested in this topic, then definitely give it a try, but just not an absolute fave. Next up we have Dear Reader, The Comfort and Joy of Books by Cathy Rentzenbrink. This was another birthday gift from Aoife over at Pretty Purple Polka Dot, so thank you very much, Aoife. This is basically a short little memoir in which Cathy Rentzenbrink talks about her life in books, her life in reading, and how books have always been there for her and have provided such comfort, particularly in times of distress in her life. And honestly, I don't know what to say about this that other people haven't said better. I just thought this was such a lovely, lovely book. It was so uplifting. At other points, it was really raw and emotional. I think especially if you are somebody who has been struggling with reading, if you've been in a bit of a reading slump and you kind of want a burst of motivation, you want a reminder of why books are so important, then this definitely will do that for you. And I think especially because it is such a short little read, it might provide that little boost for you. I think maybe the only criticism I could give of this is that maybe some of the books that she talks about you might not know and maybe won't have much of a connection to. I know that was definitely a little bit of a hindrance when I read Bookworm last year, but aside from that, it's just delightful. And I think everything that I wanted from this I got. And also, once again, moment for the beautiful cover. Next we have a book that I listened to on audiobook, which is Queens of the Crusades, Eleanor of Aquitaine and Her Successors, which is the second book in Alison Weir's England's Medieval Queen series. This is basically Alison Weir's series where she goes through the different medieval queens of England, from Matilda of Flanders in 1066, I think all the way up to maybe Elizabeth of York, or maybe not, because she has done a whole biography of Elizabeth of York. And I've been really interested in this series because I am such a fan of English queens. I find learning more about their lives really interesting. Sometimes more interesting than the monarchs that they were wives to. In this particular instalment, we are talking about Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was the wife of Henry II, Berengaria of Navarre, who was the queen to Richard I, Isabella of Angoulême, who was the queen of John, Eleanor of Provence, who was queen to Henry III, and then finally Eleanor of Castile, who was the wife to Edward I. And I was really excited for this, but to be honest with you, I found it a little bit of a letdown because I'm not really convinced in this series in the way that it depicts the individual queens. I don't see how this differentiates between any other history that I could read about this time period, and especially because my way of getting into learning about England's medieval queens was through podcasts. I honestly don't see what this book does that those podcasts didn't do better. I definitely didn't feel like I learned anything that I hadn't from those shorter form podcasts. And because it seemed like Alison Weir was just doing a general history of England rather than having a real focus on the queens, I didn't feel like she brought any new research into these women. And in some cases, these women were completely overlooked for the grander history. Queens like Berengaria of Navarre and Eleanor of Provence, I feel like barely got any sort of a look in, which a large part is probably going to be because there wasn't as much evidence for them. But it didn't feel at any point like Alison Weir kind of took the motivation, took the incentive to find out more, or to really try and consider this time period through those queens' perspectives, through their eyes, which I think is what a narrative like this should be doing, rather than just providing us a royal history that we already know. I don't know if that made any sort of sense, but yeah, I just found it a little bit of a letdown. I think I'm definitely going to pick up the next installment in this series because I am interested in how she depicts these women, but I feel like after having a few gripes with Queens of the Conquest and then finding this a bit disappointing, I'm going to be going into it with a more skeptical eye. And then next we have A Fatal Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum by Emma Southon. And I'm really hoping that there are some musical theatre fans out there who are enjoying this name as much as I am. I really enjoyed this book. This book was all about murder in ancient Rome, and basically Emma Southon's assertion that murder was just integral to ancient Rome and how it operated. And we are just seeing murder in all of its forms. We have political assassinations, we have executions, we have the abuse and murder of slaves, we've got patricide. There is so much murder in here. And of course, how could I forget the gladiatorial games? Through this book, Emma Southon is really painting this portrait of just how much murder was baked into the Roman way of life. You start to get to a point where you think that it was just murder 24/7, as if you're constantly living in a Game of Thrones kind of world. And I think at some points through this historical narrative, she's also shining a light on us, putting a mirror up to our society and the ways that murder is crucial in our own lives, but that we often kind of deny this to be the case. But talking about how we as a modern society get so much thrill out of learning about true crime, murder mysteries, and that was exactly the case in ancient Rome too. I think what will really stand out about this book, kind of similarly to A Curious History of Sex by Kate Lister, is the very irreverent colloquial style of writing that Emma Southon uses, which is something that I wasn't really expecting going into it. If you are not a fan of a sweary book, you might want to steer clear of this, because Emma Southon is not pulling any punches in her language. And like I say, I generally really enjoyed it. I think any way that you're going to make this history more accessible and more engaging and exciting for people, the better. The one gripe that I did have with this is that I was listening to it on audiobook, and I felt like the audiobook narrator that they chose just did not fit this more casual, colloquial style. She had a very posh RP accent, and I just didn't feel like it went. Also, if you are not a fan of pop culture references in your history, you might want to steer clear of this. There are a lot of allusions to Taylor Swift and to Harry Potter. I think Mad Eye Moody especially and Constant Vigilance is brought up. As well as that, towards the end, I felt my stomach kind of churn a little bit because she goes into excruciating detail about crucifixion and exactly what happened to a body when it was crucified. And like, I know that the details of this, I know what happens in crucifixion, but I still found it jarring to read. So if you are of the more squeamish sort, then you might want to avoid that chapter. But otherwise, I thought it was really fun. It's another one of those like funny history books to add to my shelf, at least when it comes out in paperback. Next up, last week through my door came this delightful thing. My friend Rachel sent me a little well done on getting your job, well done on your new house gift, which was this Good Morning, Good Night, Little Pep Talks for Me and You by Lin-Manuel Miranda, who of course was the writer and star of Hamilton and one of my favourite people. And this little book is just a lot of little pep talks taken from his Twitter account. For a while he did little morning and nighttime pep talks through tweet. For example, good morning, woke up achy and sad, not alone. Woke up with purpose and joy, not alone. Any way you slice it, you're not alone. Let's go. And then ending with, good night, headed to bed achy and sad, not alone. Headed to bed with gratitude and satisfaction, not alone. Any way you slice it, you're not alone. Let's zzz. And it's just over 100 of these little small pep talks. I definitely feel like I could have read these very, very slowly, 1 or 2 of them a day. I did not do that, and I just rushed in and read the whole thing. I just wanted to devour it as soon as possible. And that worked quite well for me. I quite enjoyed it, but maybe if you are picking this up, you might want to read it slowly. I should also note it comes with some gorgeous illustrations. Those are all done by Johnny Sum. I think if you're a fan of Lin-Manuel Miranda, if you are a fan of like motivational pep talks, then this is definitely for you. It won't be for everybody, but I enjoyed it very much. So thank you so much, Rachel, for this. My last physical book to show you in this video is The Taming of the Clueless, another gift that I got from Aoife over at Pretty Purple Polka Dots. Thank you so much. I know I've already talked your ear off about this, but this is basically the script for Clueless, but Shakespeareanized. And it is the most joyous, wonderful thing that I have so far read. If you are a fan of Clueless, if you are a fan of Shakespeare, if you're a fan especially of Emma, because of course Clueless is based on Emma by Jane Austen, then you will love this because this also includes a lot of Emma references. And I felt like Clueless worked surprisingly well in a Shakespearean 5-act structure, and I really want to see a performance of this, please. Noble patricians, patrons of my right, belike ye look upon mine excesses. My friends and I all gathered near the pool, arrayed in swimsuits, sun upon our backs, the very height of beauty, youth and joy, no cares about the future, come what will, and wonder, have I somehow stepped inside a strange advertisement for cleansing cream, Noxema, goddess Greek of lasses pure, have no role in the drama that we play. Take mine assurance, nobles, groundlings both, I am a teenage girl of normal life, who never looked to rise above her place or face the world with aught but normalcy. You get all of Clueless's most famous lines preserved in here. The as-ifs are there as ever, just with a little bit of a Shakespearean flavour. And I was recently sent this by my mother, so I'm gonna have a good month. And then the final book that I want to talk to you about today is The Unhoneymooners by Christina Lauren. Now, I've probably mentioned in a reading vlog that straight after listening to A Fatal Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, I started listening to The Only Plane in the Sky, an oral history of 9/11. And this was a book that I'd wanted to listen to on audio for such a long time. Obviously, it being an oral history, I feel like it lends really well to listening to it rather than reading. However, I realised very, very quickly that I couldn't go from Murder in Ancient Rome to 9/11 so quickly. That I needed kind of a little bit of a palate cleanser. And so The Unhoneymooners came in on my subscription feed to make me very happy and to provide a little bit of pep and joy that I otherwise would not have had. I've seen this floating around so much on BookTube, I'm sure you already know the plot of it, but let me explain quickly for you. The Unhoneymooners is a romantic comedy where we meet twin sisters Olive and Amy. Olive, who is the protagonist, who is kind of unlucky. She's quite hapless and quite unmoored. She doesn't know what she's doing with her life. She's recently lost a job and so is feeling very dissatisfied in that way. Whereas her sister Amy seems to have everything handed to her. She seems to be like a very lucky lady, and she is just about to get married, to which Olive is going to be the maid of honour. However, at the wedding reception, things take a turn. All of the wedding guests come down with a bout of food poisoning as a result of some bad shellfish. All of the wedding guests, aside from Olive, but also the best man, brother of the groom Ethan, does not come down with food poisoning either, as a result of his distaste for buffet food. At which point the bride Amy discloses to Olive that she has got this all expenses paid for honeymoon booked, which they cannot get refunds on. And so as a result of this series of unfortunate events, Olive and Ethan end up going on that honeymoon with each other, despite the fact that we are told from the outset that they hate each other. And what you get is this classic enemies to lovers story, in which Olive and Ethan start to get to know each other better and start to find that maybe they are not as despicable as they previously thought. Like I say, it's a simple story. It's an enemies to lovers story that we know very well, but I needed it and I enjoyed it so much. I found it very enjoyable. I ended up listening to the audiobook within a day and I ended up going, oh, at the ending. So, you know, that's how it's worked. It's worked its magic on me. I don't think there's anything mind-blowing about this book, but it did what I needed it to do, which was to cheer me up and like, I'm happy. So if you are in the mood for a rom-com, then I highly recommend this. So there we have it. Those are all of the books that I have read in the first half of April. I'm hoping I can keep this reading motivation up for the rest of the month. Fingers crossed for me. Do let me know if you've read any of the books that I've spoken about today, and do let me know about any books that you've read. I'd love to hear from you. I hope you're having a fantastic, fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.